If we're going to clap them, let's clap them properly, okay? Yeah, let's. Well done, Eurus. Um, so we are tying up our series on grace. This could be the last week of the series. It might not be. It's the way it works around here. um, Next week is actually Prisoners' Week, which we always mark. So it's something around the country where we stop and just think about those who are in prison. So I've got the sneaking suspicion that grace may come up next week. And then after that, we'll just stop talking about it completely. We'll never mention grace ever again. It will be like it never happened. No, of course not. Today we're in Luke 7. It's Jesus eating another meal. No wonder they called him a glutton and a drunkard. They tried to smear him with this stuff because he was always eating at someone's house, always around someone's house, eating all their food. We've all got a friend like that, don't we? Don't point at me. And dinner in the Middle East is different. You know, dinner in most parts of the world is very different to the way that we do it, or perhaps we don't do it here. You know, Jesus was invited as an esteemed guest to Simon the Pharisee's house. Simon was a rich man. He would have gone all out, you know, no expense spared, so much so that people would have come to watch and listen in to their conversation and basically watch them having dinner. Should be a bit strange. I wouldn't really want many people to come around to my house. And in fact, I wouldn't want anybody to come and watch us having dinner at the moment. But this is what they did. People would just kind of, you know, sit around and watch them, and they'd have, you know, big lofty conversations about the meaning of life and philosophy and how to live and who God was. And people would come and listen. And maybe sometimes people would come and hope that they would get some leftover food as well. And they were reclining on these low couches. And the whole thing was sort of very theatrical. People listening in. It would have been a long time together. You know, 3, 4, 5 hours would have been nothing to these guys. And I just wanted to say this publicly. We've got John and Sally coming around for lunch today, guys. Do not get any ideas. Any longer than 45 minutes, I'm going to get quite fidgety. I'll just start making excuses. So no 5-hour dinners, thank you very much for us. But that's the scene. You've got two main characters in this story as well. Aside from Jesus, you've got a man and a woman. And Luke characterizes them as the man is a Pharisee, and the woman is a quote-unquote sinful woman. Some of us may have heard about Pharisees before. Some might not. That's okay. But I wonder if you have heard a little bit about Pharisees, what would be the words that you might use to? Somebody said, "What's a Pharisee?" What would you say to them? Anybody want to shout out? Hypocrite. Okay. Yep. Expert in the law. Yep. Anybody else? What would they be known for alongside those things that we've heard? Authority. Okay. Yep. I'd written down discipline, rules, you know, clarity, strictness, and yet, of course, hypocrisy and the fact that they didn't always adhere to the motive behind a lot of these rules, but just they became idols in themselves. Anyway, you know, Pharisees, they'd have a CrossFit membership, 100%, and they would check the calories on things at Greg's and then go and gorge themselves when nobody was looking. And if you think about it, we don't really know what the sinful woman had been up to, but it's fairly safe to assume that she was a contrasting figure from the Pharisee. The Pharisee was known for discipline, clarity, focus, expertise on the 365 different laws that they had to abide by and make sure they didn't get wrong. But we don't know much about her life or anything at all, but we know that her life probably wasn't based around discipline and focus, that she'd run into hard times, that she'd potentially made some quite significant mistakes as well. So you've got two characters, you've got two opposing characters, both interacting with Jesus in entirely contrasting ways. And the woman doesn't hang around in embracing Jesus. And the first opportunity, she began to wet his feet with her tears. It says, as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. And then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. You've got to use your imagination, don't you, to kind of get into that place of what that must have felt like, what that must have been like for her, but been like for those around her as well. I wonder what prompted her to do this. It looks like there was a lot going on for her. Were the tears of shame? Were they tears of exhaustion or relief or joy that she'd finally met this man, potentially that she'd heard so much about? Why did she pick out Jesus as somebody to be close to in this moment? There's a desperation maybe that comes, or I think exhaustion for me kind of comes out. Just so exhausted, just being ground down by life. I just need to connect with Jesus. I've heard what he can do. I've heard so many things about him. There's something special about him. And Jesus didn't turn her away, did he? Jesus let her come and bring her adoration and her affection, even to this point of physicality where it must have been a little bit awkward for some of the other people in the room. Okay, we'll just let them figure that one out. So that's her. It's intense. It's very real. And it's very passionate. And Simon, on the other hand, the Pharisee, is disgusted. He's absolutely disgusted with what's going on in his own home. And he doesn't respond with curiosity. He's not intrigued really with how this is all playing out. But he responds with judgment. He peels off kind of like this Shakespearean villain. Some of you with long memories will remember that at the beginning of this series, Claudia memorized the whole Shakespeare kind of soliloquy, and I can't do that. But it does remind me kind of like a Shakespeare, kind of comes across a bit like a pantomime villain where he says, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who's touching him and what kind of woman that she is, a sinner. You know, you can imagine taking that to the King's Theatre and everyone going, boo, you know, he's the baddie. He also says to himself, he says to himself that because Jesus doesn't rebuke this woman, doesn't castigate this woman, therefore, Jesus is not the prophet that he claims to be. So he cancels the woman because of her behavior. He doesn't like what she's doing. And he also cancels Jesus too. He says, because you haven't rejected her, because you've let her come with her tears and her perfume and her alabaster jar, I'm going to cancel you as well. So what Luke is really clearly trying to set up as he tells us this story is just the contrasting journeys of these two people and how they respond to Jesus. The woman honors Jesus Christ with everything she has. Not just her stuff, but her emotion, her whole self, you know. But the man, Simon, do you think he expected Jesus to say, listen, Simon, I'm kind of going along with this, but really, can you just eject her at the most convenient opportunity? Did he expect Jesus to say, listen, this is not what I signed up for. She's ruining my night. It's all a bit intense. Can you just deal with her? I don't know what Simon expected Jesus to say, but what he did say was that he told her a story. He told him a story, sorry. And it's an incredibly simple story. But it's a story that helped unveil the truth of what was really going on in that room on that night. Two people owed money. One of them owned a bit. The other owed a lot more. Two people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, a lot. The other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay the moneylender back, and so he forgave the debts of both. Now, Simon, which one of them will love him more? Which one of them will love him more? He tells a story to kind of unveil and reveal really what's going on in the room. Isn't it crazy how a story can just unlock a truth that kind of everyone knew was going on? But Jesus puts his finger on it. I'll come back to it in a second. I wonder if anybody here has ever fallen out with anybody over money. Anybody? I'm asking you to be I would have thought, come on, at least 90% of the room has fallen out. None of you got brothers or sisters or anything like that. When I was 16, I went on holiday to Aviemore with a few friends. And I can't actually remember the circumstance that led to me writing this poem, but I did. There was, you go on holiday with a few friends, there's money exchanged, there's money withheld, there's accusations flying around, and I wrote this poem called Moon Descending, all right? This is just a bit of light relief in another intense sermon from me. And this is actually its world premiere, okay, I think, in public. 16-year-old Thomas wrote this. Moon Descending. You ready for it? Okay. Moon descending, money lending, between friends, friendship ends. It's quite bleak, isn't it? I don't really know what was going on with me. But basically, why I included that was that Jesus told stories that everyone could relate to, didn't he? Everybody knows a story of being forgiven a debt, of cancelling another debt, of working through just the everyday stuff of life with one another. In this story, both of their debts were forgiven. Great. But who's going to be happier? And Simon must have rolled his eyes because remember, there's people watching on, there's people listening to what his answer is going to be. And he says, well, it's the one who's been forgiven more money, of course. This is kind of Sunday school stuff. He knew it, but he hadn't grasped it with his whole life. He knew what the right answer was, but he hadn't grasped it with the way that he chose to live and the way that he chose to interact with those around him. Christianity is not the religion of correct answers. It's about a relationship with the living God. And more specifically, it's about receiving the grace of God. You can have all the answers. You can give the right answers to Jesus when he asks you that story, and you can know what the correct answer is. But the reality is Simon was living something completely opposite to what he had just said. None of this makes sense without grasping grace. And Simon was struggling with this big time. The woman with the perfume in her hands had struggled a lot in life. I'm guessing that she had seen it all, been through it all. But one thing she didn't struggle with, I think, was grace. She just got grace. She just knew that Jesus wouldn't reject her. She just knew that she could go and be with him. She desperately needed it. She was under no false illusions of her own righteousness. And she graciously received everything that Jesus had to offer her. And 100 years ago, there was a conference on religion where some experts were debating on the subject of what makes Christianity really unique. Some suggested the incarnation, Jesus taking on flesh and becoming human. But since other religions have got different versions of God appearing in human form, they thought that's not it. Others suggested the resurrection, but some replied that other religions had accounts of people returning from death, so that was eliminated too. And after a few hours of this debate, C.S. Lewis waded in. Some of you have heard of him. He's an amazing Christian thinker and writer. And he walked into the room and he said, apparently he used the word rumpus, and he said, what's all this rumpus about? And someone said, well, we're discussing Christianity's unique contribution among world religions. And in his kind of forthright, straight to the point manner said, oh, that's easy. It's grace. Oh, that's easy. It's grace. And in telling this story of the two debtors to Simon in his own home, in front of everybody, Jesus drives home the message of grace. I want to ask you a question, one that I haven't asked anybody in a number of years. Can we just get this next photo? What color is the dress? Anybody? Blue and black? Well, you can't say both. Did somebody say blue and black and white and gold? It's not all four, is it? What are we seeing? We're seeing blue and black. Okay, anybody want to disagree with that? You're seeing white and gold? Okay. Some people are seeing white and gold. Some people are seeing blue and black. Some people think, I'm never coming back to this church ever again. What on earth is going on? Okay, we'll settle the debate. You can talk about it over tea and coffee later. But you know, I think, the same impact that image has on people and completely divides people's responses and the way that they perceive it, I think grace has the same impact on people. And it certainly did in this story. You know, we can look on a life transformed. We can look on that woman's journey and say, hallelujah, isn't God amazing? Isn't it amazing that that woman has found Jesus? That there's a fresh start for her, that she can bring all of her shame and all of her experience and be met with love and mercy. That's one way of looking at grace. Or you can look at someone like this woman weeping, overwhelmed in a public setting, and just think, that's embarrassing. She needs to just get herself together at some point. Don't have any time for that. You know, grace and the way that God meets us at our lowest, worst, rock bottom, and picks us up. Grace is a foul stench to some people. For some people, grace is not nice. You know, when our lives are all based on works, proving ourselves, lifting ourselves up, doing it ourselves, grace is a foul stench to a lot of people in our world. But to every person, I think there are other people where it's like sweet incense. And how we respond to grace. And that's why we set up this whole thing. And I think Luke sets up this whole thing in the passage we've read. How we respond to the grace of God will ultimately be the thing that defines us. Loads of vying labels in our world and our lives that want to define us. But I think this is the thing that will define us. Do we respond to God's grace with hallelujahs and thanksgiving and celebration, or do we respond to grace with disgust and thinking, well, I wouldn't do it like that? Verse 47, Jesus says, therefore, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Whoever has been forgiven little loves little. If you don't really think that you need grace at all, I wonder how that feels. I genuinely don't know how that feels, but you know, there are loads and loads of us, aren't there, out there, who think, I've got friends, I don't need forgiving for anything. I don't need mercy, I'm just doing my own thing. If you don't really think you need grace, it's not going to feel that amazing. Maybe it'll feel a bit nice from time to time when you come to church or whatever. But to be honest, you think, God, I would have been okay even if you hadn't died for me. I would have found a way. I would have been all right. Jesus says in Mark chapter 2, those who are well have no need of a physician or a doctor, but those who are sick, well, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And when you've been on the brink of hell on earth in your life, if you've been written off by everyone around you, if you've been working sort of against God's plan for your life for however long you can remember, and then suddenly you're met with the grace of God in the eyes of Jesus Christ. Grace means everything. It means everything. Grace hits so differently from any other word that could be spoken to our hearts by anybody. Grace tastes unexpected because you didn't see it coming, and it tastes sweet because it's amazing. If you've ever been around babies, some of us are around babies a lot at the moment, you'll know that they have this amazing kind of grabbing, grasping reflex. Any doctors in the room want to tell me exactly what it's called? Anybody feeling confident? Grasp reflex. Almost. It's actually called I don't know how you pronounce this, Palmer grasp reflex, just to show you that I looked up Wikipedia basically. And it comes naturally. Maybe some of you will know it, you can just think about it or grab the person beside you's finger if you know them. And I was reading about it, and it's this kind of reflex grabbing reaction. It even starts in the womb from as early as 16 weeks, where you're touched and then you just grab it. If something is placed within their hand, it triggers within them something that just grabs. And it only lasts until about 6 months, which is really sad. As I have a daughter who is 6 months, so those days are limited. But it's almost like we hit 6 months as humans, and then we start to unlearn that reflex of dependency, of just grabbing when we're offered warmth and love. And dependence becomes king, and as we grow up as humans, grace is God placing his loving kindness right in our faces, right in our hands. That's what grace is. God is the mover in grace. He makes the first move. He takes the initiative. And the question is, are we going to grab onto it or not? We're going to grab onto it or not. Simon failed to grasp grace, but the woman grabbed it, I think, with both hands. She grabbed it with both hands, and suddenly it meant everything to her. And their responses, a bit like their initial actions, couldn't have been more different. We don't have time to go into their responses, but Jesus kind of takes them blow by blow. Well, you came in, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you barely noticed I was here, but she washed me, welcomed me, wept over me. If you want to know really how you feel about God's grace, if you don't know in your mind, just think and examine your response to Jesus. What has your response to Jesus looked like so far in your life? I mean, it's not rocket science, It's certainly not a competition. We don't compare our responses against one another's. God is far more interested in what is happening in our hearts than on the surface. But ultimately, how we respond with our lives shows us really what we think about the grace of God. Do we grab on? Or are we not interested? And Paul, the Apostle Paul, when praying for the church in Ephesus, quite some years later, he prayed this amazing prayer that I felt God just reminded me around to share with us this morning. And he said this: I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. What an amazing prayer. Paul prays for the church, for us, that we would have the power to grasp God's grace, to even just begin to get our heads around how amazing his love is for each one of us. And like a tiny baby, just accept God's hand of kindness and just say, yes, this is what I need. And yes, I don't want to grow up from this. Yes, I don't want to leave this behind. I want to be on my deathbed, grateful for the grace of God. Paul's best prayer was that we would grab hold again to the love of God. Its width, the wideness of its mercy, its length that spans out before us and will span out after us as well. Its height that covers even our worst offenses. And its depth that goes beneath even the parts of us that we don't want to show anybody, even ourselves. Jesus said in Luke 7 verse 49, well, they said about Jesus, who is this man who forgives sins? Who is this man who forgives sins? He's Jesus Christ. He's the Son of God. Do you know what it took for our sins to be forgiven? Could we ever truly comprehend the true height and depth and width? For the God of heaven to stoop so low and come with such humility and grace. So either you grasp grace at some level, or you don't. You reject it and you say, I don't need it. I don't want that in my life. Either it touches you and transforms your life, sometimes really quickly, sometimes just over a long, burning period of time, or it doesn't. One thing is that you can't fake it. You can't fake being touched by the grace of God, but you can revisit the cross again and again and again and just say, Jesus, reveal yourself to me. Show up in my life the way that you showed up in the world 2,000 years ago, and help me to be free. Help me to be free.